Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is literally a radical new understanding of one of the most devastating medical challenges out there, chronic pain. For the longest time, the medical world has looked at chronic pain through a very specific and honestly probably flawed lens. So we're going to unpack this huge paradigm shift in neuroscience that might just completely change how we treat suffering. If you, or maybe someone you know, has been dealing with pain that just absolutely refuses to quit, well, you're going to want to stick around because this is incredibly insightful. So here's the big medical mystery we're tackling today. Why have decades of opioid treatments that have been heavily prescribed and relied upon for so long, why have they fundamentally failed so many people? Millions of Americans are just trapped in this endless cycle of suffering. And to understand how we can actually break that cycle, we've got to first look at exactly what is failing them right now. Which brings us to Section 1, the chronic pain epidemic. Look at this number, over 50 million. That's over 50 million Americans living with persistent, daily, chronic pain. And to be clear, we are not talking about the acute pain of a fresh injury, right? The kind that actually serves a biological purpose to protect you while you heal. No, we're talking about pain that has entirely outlasted its original cause, sticking around for years. At this point, it exists as a disease in its own right. It degrades a person's quality of life to the point where, honestly, living barely even feels like the right word. And the macro impact? It's staggering. $600 billion. That is the annual cost of chronic pain just in the United States. To put that into perspective for a second, that totally dwarfs the cost of diabetes, heart disease, and cancer combined. It's just a massive, completely system-draining burden. But the real tragedy here is this statistic, 80%. According to the American Academy of Pain Medicine, 80% of these patients are inadequately treated by current medicine. Think about that. The go-to pharmacological response for the last 3 decades has basically been opioids. But opioids hasn't cured the underlying disease, have they? Instead, they've fueled one of the worst addiction epidemics in recorded history. They're failing us because, well, they're targeting the wrong problem entirely. All right, let's move to Section 2. The twist, a brain reorganization disease. I want you to consider this incredibly powerful insight from researcher A. Vanya Upkarian. He says chronic pain is not an injury that failed to heal. It is a learned brain state. This is a total game changer. When pain doesn't resolve, your brain actually undergoes structural reorganization. Like gray matter density literally shifts away from sensory processing regions and moves over toward emotional and self-referential processing regions. Your brain literally rearranges itself around the pain. This is so validating for sufferers to hear because it means the pain is real, it is physical, but the actual location of the problem, it's moved. It's moved from the body's tissues straight up into the brain itself. Now, a lot of this reorganization centers around something called the default mode network, or the DMN. You can think of the DMN kind of like your brain's self-modeling system. It's what maintains the narrative of who you are. But in chronic pain, this network goes into overdrive. It becomes hyperactive. It's like an amplifier that's just stuck on volume 10. It ends up encoding a completely new reality, cementing the patient's identity as someone who is always in pain. So the brain isn't just sitting around waiting to receive pain signals anymore, it's actively anticipating them, and in many cases, actually generating them. And the clinical result of all this rewiring is what we call central sensitization. Basically, the central nervous system gets so incredibly hypersensitive that it amplifies signals completely out of proportion. I mean, a light touch can feel like pure agony, or the brain might just generate intense pain with absolutely zero physical stimulus from the body at all. Nothing. The amplifier just will not turn off, and that DMN we talked about keeps running this constant, low-level simulation of suffering. So how do we stop this? Section 3. How psilocybin disrupts pain. It turns out psilocybin mounts this really remarkable 3-part attack on the root causes of chronic pain. Let's break it down. First up, it disrupts DMN coherence. By acting on specific serotonin receptors, it essentially scrambles that hyperactive pain network we just talked about. It temporarily dissolves the rigid architecture that's maintaining that pain identity. Okay, second part. It reduces neuroinflammation. It essentially cools the inflammatory fire in the brain's immune cells, the very fire that keeps central sensitization running. And third, it increases dendritic spine density. Simply put, it physically helps your brain grow new, healthy pathways. How amazing is that? Which actually brings us to something called the rebus model. You see, chronic pain relies on the brain having this extreme confidence in its expectation of pain. It turns into this nasty, self-fulfilling prophecy. But psilocybin? It effectively lowers the brain's confidence in those rigid expectations. It temporarily drops the precision weighting of that top-down narrative. This is huge because it allows your nervous system to finally reevaluate incoming signals without just automatically amplifying them into agony. It literally lets the brain let go of the pain narrative. All right, let's look at the real-world proof. Section 4, the clinical evidence. Cluster headaches and fibromyalgia. So cluster headaches are clinically referred to as the suicide headache. And guys, that is not hyperbole. These attacks are routinely rated a 9 or 10 on pain scales, and they can happen multiple times a day. Patients describe it as literally the worst pain a human being can possibly experience. And the worst part? Standard treatments often provide absolute zero relief. We really have to understand the extreme, debilitating agony of this condition to fully appreciate what happens next. Check this out. A 2021 Yale study produced some genuinely stunning results. They used a sub-psychedelic dose of psilocybin, meaning a dose so low it doesn't even cause significant psychedelic effects, and researchers saw attack frequencies drop by 50% or more in a majority of the participants. And here is the absolutely crucial part. The effects lasted for weeks beyond the time the drug was actually in their system. It broke the cycle. I mean, this kind of lasting relief, it's virtually without precedent in headache medicine. And we're also seeing some truly remarkable implications for fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is kind of the ultimate central sensitization disorder. It's widespread pain with absolutely no identifiable tissue damage, and historically, it's been considered highly untreatable. But because it is purely driven by that hyperactive default mode network we talked about, psilocybin is uniquely suited to target it. In fact, preliminary trials are already showing patients experiencing major drops in pain catastrophizing. It's like the emotional weight of the pain just lifts, and their entire relationship to the suffering fundamentally shifts. Let's put this into perspective. Section 5, the contrast. Opioids versus psilocybin. Okay, so opioids primarily just block pain signals at the spinal cord. And sure, they're great for acute pain, but over time they actually cause something called hyperalgesia. Basically, they make the central nervous system even more sensitive to pain, so they're effectively worsening the exact disease they're meant to treat, all while carrying a massive, massive addiction risk. Psilocybin, on the other hand, operates completely differently. It safely reorganizes the brain's architecture, it promotes neuroplasticity, and it carries absolutely zero risk of addiction or respiratory depression. It isn't just masking the signal, it's going right after the structural disease itself. Now for the really exciting part. Section 6, the neuroplasticity window. Just look at the physical change happening in the brain here. A single dose of psilocybin increases dendritic spine density in the prefrontal cortex by 10% within just 24 hours. That's incredibly fast. Now, why does that matter? Well, in chronic pain, the prefrontal cortex is often atrophied, meaning it literally loses its ability to put the brakes on those runaway pain signals. Psilocybin physically grows new connections to restore those regulatory brakes. It creates this amazing window where the brain is suddenly incredibly adaptable. But the ultimate key here is how we actually use that window. The future of pain medicine probably won't just be taking a pill and calling it a day. It's going to be a full protocol. Think about it like this. Step 1, a psilocybin session opens up the brain and disrupts that rigid pain network. Step 2, that neuroplasticity window begins. And then step 3, during this specific window of really high adaptability, patients undergo intensive physical and cognitive rehab. We're using pharmacology to create the right biological conditions, and then we're using therapy to hardwire a brand new, healthy, pain-free self-model. It's a total paradigm shift. Which leaves us with this final thought. For decades, we have been throwing medications at the body's tissues, just hoping to shut off an alarm that was actually hardwired deep inside the brain. But now, with the emergence of this new neuroscience, we finally have a clear structural roadmap to break the cycle of central sensitization once and for all. So the big question isn't just about whether we're ready for a new compound, it's really about whether we're ready for a whole new paradigm. Are we finally ready to treat the brain and not just the body? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. I really hope it sparked some serious curiosity for you. Catch you next time.